Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it lightly, like it was a clever observation she'd rehearsed. We were seated around her parents' long dining table, plates still warm, wine half finished. Someone joked about how married life must be exhausting, and she laughed and said intimacy was overrated, that people obsessed over it because they were insecure, that real connection didn't need any of that. She said it the way people say something they expect applause for. The room went quiet for half a second, then polite smiles filled the gap. I felt something in me stop moving. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the table, on the smooth which she'd insisted we buy from Crate and Barrel because it felt intentional. Her sister nodded. Her mother smiled in approval. It sounded like maturity to them. To me, it sounded like a door being closed in front of witnesses. I'm a city planner. My work is about what lasts longer than anyone's attention span. Transit lines, zoning maps, neighborhoods that don't collapse under pressure. I think in decades. She always said she admired that about me. She worked in sustainable development, spoke in clean sentences about balance and meaning. At home, she used those same words to explain distance, to reframe absence as growth. I had accepted it quietly, believing we were building something slower, deeper. That night, though, the way she said it felt practiced. Not personal, almost protective, as if she was defending a position she'd already taken elsewhere. I didn't challenge her. I didn't joke it away or look wounded. I just withdrew from the table without anyone noticing. I watched how easily she held the room while erasing me from the picture. No one asked what I thought. No one noticed I'd gone silent. Later, as dessert was served, she leaned back in her chair, relaxed, untouchable. I realized she wasn't embarrassed. She was relieved. Saying it out loud made it official. It gave her cover. Whatever she was getting somewhere else no longer needed to be hidden if intimacy itself had been declared unnecessary. On the drive home, I didn't bring it up. She talked about an upcoming family call, how everyone should stay connected even when life got busy. I nodded and focused on the road. In my head, I was already redrawing the map. Not of the city, of my life. I didn't disappear that night. I just stopped reaching for something that had already been taken away. The first crack didn't come from her. It never does. It came from someone who had no reason to lie and no interest in protecting the story she was telling. A week after that dinner, I ran into Mark, an old colleague who now consulted for the same nonprofit circle she moved in. It was an accidental overlap, the kind that happens in cities no matter how carefully you plan your routes. We talked about work, about a zoning proposal that had stalled, about nothing personal. Then he paused, just slightly, and said he'd seen my wife recently. He mentioned it casually, like background noise. Said she looked relaxed, lighter than usual. He said she was with someone who knew her well. He didn't say a name. He didn't have to. The way he phrased it told me this wasn't new, and it wasn't serious enough to announce, but it was familiar enough to feel safe. Comfortable. The kind of comfort that doesn't ask questions. I didn't ask him anything else. I thanked him for the update on a project we were both pretending to care about and walked away. On the surface, nothing changed. At home, she still spoke in careful language. She still framed distance as growth, autonomy as progress. She still scheduled family check-ins over Zoom and reminded me to be present, even when I was already fading out of frame. What shifted was internal, something precise. The difference between uncertainty and confirmation isn't emotion. It's clarity. I stopped interpreting. I stopped hoping there was a misunderstanding buried under her words. I started noticing patterns instead. The way she guarded her phone without seeming defensive. The way her explanations sounded rehearsed, like talking points. The way she no longer looked for me when she entered a room. At night, I walked longer routes through the city, listening to audiobooks through Audible, letting other voices fill the space she'd evacuated. I didn't confront her. Confrontation assumes negotiation. I was past that. I was mapping exits. One evening, she mentioned her ex in passing. Not directly, just a reference to someone who understood her before life got complicated. She said it with nostalgia, not regret. I watched her face when she said it. There was no guilt there, only relief. That's when I knew the dinner wasn't a slip. It was a declaration. She'd reduced intimacy to theory so she wouldn't have to account for where she was actually living it. I didn't accuse her. I didn't retreat dramatically. I just began removing weight from the structure. Quietly. Strategically. Because when a building is compromised, you don't argue with the crack. You prepare for the separation. Evidence doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates in quiet, humiliating increments. A pattern of absences. Transactions that don't align with the story you're being told. Small adjustments made with the confidence of someone who assumes you aren't looking. I didn't go searching for proof the way people imagine. I wasn't digging through her phone or interrogating timelines. I simply stopped filling in the blanks for her. When you remove your own assumptions, what remains becomes obvious. There were calendar gaps she couldn't explain without turning abstract. There were errands that took too long and came back with nothing to show for them. And then there were the charges. Not dramatic amounts, just enough to indicate intention. A hotel booking she mentioned too late, framed as a work-related overnight that didn't need discussion. I recognized the platform when I saw the confirmation flash briefly on her screen. Booking. Calm. She closed it quickly, but the movement was muscle memory. Practiced. I didn't react. I didn't change my expression. That was the moment I understood how little reaction mattered. The truth didn't need acknowledgement to exist. It just needed space. At home, everything stayed pristine. The house still looked staged, the kind of calm you buy and arrange carefully. Furniture chosen to imply harmony. I passed through those rooms like a guest. The table, the shelves, the neutral colors she'd curated so meticulously no longer registered as ours. They were props. She moved through them confidently, unaware that the structure had already shifted beneath her feet. I kept my routines intact. Went to work. Came home on time. Listened more than I spoke. When she talked about boundaries and emotional maturity, I nodded. When she spoke about how intimacy distracted people from their higher purpose, I accepted the explanation without comment. That acceptance unsettled her more than any argument would have. She watched me closely, as if waiting for resistance she could manage. At night, I walked again. Same streets, different awareness. I replayed conversations, not for pain, but for accuracy. I noticed how often her words created distance while her body sought familiarity elsewhere. How easily she separated meaning from behavior. I wasn't hurt the way people expect. Hurt implies surprise. What I felt was alignment. The story finally matched the data. I began moving pieces without announcing it. Shifting commitments. Canceling future plans quietly. Preparing for absence the way you prepare for winter, long before the temperature drops. She thought she had time. She thought I was still invested in understanding. She didn't realize I was already transitioning from presence to memory. I didn't announce anything. Disappearances that need explanation aren't disappearances at all. They're negotiations. I wasn't negotiating. It started with small absences she didn't register as threats. I canceled a weekend visit to her parents and blamed a deadline. I skipped a birthday dinner and sent a neutral message that sounded responsible enough not to question. When she mentioned an upcoming holiday and said we'd coordinate later, I nodded and said we had time. I already knew I wouldn't be there. The actual leaving happened on a Tuesday morning. No argument. No scene. She was in the shower, steam fogging the mirror, her phone buzzing on the counter with notifications she assumed were private. I packed light. A single bag. Functional. Neutral. The kind of choices you make when you don't intend to return to explain them. I wore my Patagonia jacket because it blended in anywhere and asked nothing from anyone. Before closing the door, I looked around the house one last time. The furniture still aligned perfectly. Everything from crate and barrel stood exactly where it was meant to stand, untouched, curated for a life that required an audience. It no longer felt like a space I occupied. It felt like a display I'd walked past too many times. I booked a one-way stay on Booking. Calm from the driveway. No destination she'd recognize as emotional. Just distance. Enough to create silence. Enough to make questions echo. The car started without hesitation. The Volvo XC60 felt heavier than usual, not because of weight, but because it carried finality well. I drove without urgency, without music. When the city thinned out, I put on an audiobook and let another voice narrate the transition. Audible made it easy not to think about what I wasn't saying. I didn't block her. I didn't disappear digitally. That would have looked dramatic. I simply stopped responding. Messages stacked. Calls went unanswered. Hours turned into days. She tried different tones. Casual first, then concerned, then sharp. I watched none of it in real time. The first Zoom call I missed confused her. The second unsettled her. By the third, she was explaining my absence to people who expected me to be present. She said I was busy. She said work was intense. She said I needed space. Each version contradicted the last. I stayed quiet. Silence doesn't argue back. It lets other people notice patterns. By the time she realized this wasn't temporary, I was already living inside a routine that didn't include her questions. I hadn't vanished. I had just removed myself from the frame she controlled. And without me there to anchor it, the story she'd been telling started to sound thin. I didn't need to confront the other man. People like him collapse under their own weight when pressure changes. All I had to do was remove the shelter she provided. Distance has a way of exposing dependencies. Once I was gone, her schedule began to fracture. She reached out more often, not to connect, but to stabilize the narrative. She needed me present in theory, even if not in practice. My absence created gaps she couldn't smooth over with language. She started explaining me to others before they even asked. On family Zoom calls, she filled the silence quickly, offering updates about my work, my stress, my need for solitude. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they contradicted each other. People noticed. Not dramatically, just enough to store the detail away. Meanwhile, the man from her past became visible by default. He was no longer hidden behind my presence. When you remove a long-term structure, temporary supports are forced into view. He didn't know how to stand where I had stood. He wasn't built for it. He showed up inconsistently. He avoided questions. He brought comfort, not continuity. I stayed out of it completely. No warnings. No interference. I let reality do the work. From a distance, I watched how quickly convenience collapses when it's mistaken for stability. My days took on a clean rhythm. Long walks in unfamiliar neighborhoods. Hours listening to Audible, absorbing other people's conclusions so I didn't circle my own. The more time passed, the less reactive I felt. What replaced it wasn't numbness. It was precision. She sent messages framed as concern for me, but they were really assessments of damage control. When that didn't work, the tone shifted to frustration, then confusion, then urgency. She needed a response to anchor herself against. Silence gave her nothing to hold. One evening, she mentioned a problem with someone close to her. She didn't name him, but she didn't have to. Her words described disappointment masked as understanding. She said people were complicated. She said expectations were unfair. I read it once and didn't reply. That was the first time she realized I wasn't coming back to clarify anything. I wasn't waiting to be understood. I had already moved past the phase where explanations mattered. Without me absorbing the impact, everything she'd deferred started hitting at once. Her family sensed it. Her colleagues sensed it. Even the man she'd chosen sensed the imbalance. I didn't engineer the fallout. I simply stopped buffering it. And once the buffering was gone, the structure she'd leaned on began to show exactly how temporary it had always been. The shift became visible to other people before it became real to her. That's how these things usually happen. You lose control socially long before you feel it emotionally. It started with a family call she couldn't postpone. A holiday planning Zoom where my name came up too naturally to ignore. Someone asked when I'd be back in town. Someone else asked if work had finally eased up. She answered quickly, too quickly, stacking explanations the way people stack chairs after an event that ended badly. I wasn't feeling well. I needed space. I was overwhelmed. The words landed, but they didn't settle. Silence on a group call is different from silence between two people. It lingers. It invites judgment without accusation. She filled it again, smiling too much, redirecting the conversation toward logistics. I wasn't there to ground her story anymore. Without me, it floated. A week later, she went to her parents' house alone. My chair stayed empty. No one made a comment at first. They didn't need to. Absence works best when it's allowed to be noticed without explanation. Her mother asked if I'd been traveling. Her sister asked if everything was okay. Each question sounded casual. None of them were. She defended me before anyone criticized. That was the tell. People don't defend what isn't under threat. She spoke about independence, about modern relationships, about how closeness didn't require constant proximity. It sounded familiar. It sounded like the dinner table speech that had started all of this. Only now, it wasn't being received as insight. It was being measured against reality. At home, the house amplified the quiet. The same carefully chosen furniture from crate and barrel now framed her solitude instead of our image. Order without presence reads differently. It stops looking intentional and starts looking staged. She messaged me afterward, describing the visit as exhausting. She said families expected too much. She said she hated feeling judged. I didn't respond. I let her sit with the discomfort of having to explain me without my cooperation. The calls kept happening. Friends checked in. Colleagues asked neutral questions that carried weight. Where was I working from now? How long had I been gone? She answered them all, but every answer widened the gap between the version of our marriage she presented and the one people were starting to infer. I didn't correct anything. I didn't clarify my absence. I let her voice be the only one in the room long enough for others to realize what it was missing. By the time she noticed that people were no longer reassured by her explanations, it was too late to adjust the narrative. The empty space where I used to be had already become the loudest part of the conversation. Isolation doesn't arrive as emptiness. It arrives as noise that no longer leads anywhere. She started reaching out to people more often, not for connection, but for confirmation. Short calls, long messages, explanations delivered before questions were asked. The more she spoke, the less anchored she sounded. I could hear it even through text. The tension of someone trying to hold a shape that no longer had a frame. I stayed quiet on purpose, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. I wasn't disappearing to punish her. I was stepping far enough back to see what existed without me propping it up. My days had simplified. Mornings without negotiation. Evenings without anticipation. I walked unfamiliar streets, listened to Audible while the city moved around me, let other people's stories pass through without sticking. The distance wasn't numbing. It was sharpening. I noticed how little of my energy had been returned in the final months. How much effort had gone into maintaining something already hollow. She tried a different approach. Messages framed as concern, then as nostalgia. She referenced shared memories without naming what had replaced them. She talked about growth, about phases, about how relationships evolve. She didn't mention the other man. She didn't need to. His presence was already implied by her absence from herself. What unsettled her most wasn't that I was gone. It was that I wasn't asking to be let back in. No anger. No demands. No need for validation. That kind of silence destabilizes people who rely on reaction to feel real. At home, the isolation thickened. The house no longer reflected anything back to her. The furniture didn't respond. The rooms didn't soften. The order she'd curated now emphasized how alone she was in it. She had removed intimacy publicly. Now she was living inside the consequences privately. She asked once, indirectly, if I was coming back. Not in those words. She asked whether I thought distance had a purpose or if it eventually became permanent. I read it, set the phone down, and went for a longer walk than usual. I wasn't withholding an answer. I had already given it through consistency. The man she'd chosen couldn't fill the space. He wasn't meant to. He offered relief, not stability. When the questions grew heavier, he grew lighter. He had no interest in standing where someone else had carried weight for years. By the time she understood that she was alone in a way that couldn't be reframed, I had already adjusted to a life where her confusion no longer registered as urgency. I wasn't isolating her. I was simply no longer preventing it. The confrontation didn't happen the way she'd imagined it would. There was no dramatic reunion, no emotional spill she could manage or redirect. It happened quietly, because by then quiet was the only language I was still using. She asked to see me in person after weeks of indirect questions and unanswered messages. Not to argue, not to accuse. She framed it as a need for clarity, as if clarity were something I'd misplaced and could hand back. I agreed without enthusiasm. Agreement costs nothing when you're already detached. We met in a public place she chose carefully, neutral enough to feel safe. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not fragile, just unanchored. She spoke first, filling the space the way she always had, explaining how confusing the last few weeks had been, how my absence had created misunderstandings she couldn't control. She said people were asking questions. She said the silence was becoming uncomfortable. I let her talk until she ran out of structure, until her sentences started circling instead of moving forward. When she stopped, she waited for me to repair something, to reassure her that this was temporary, that I still belonged to the version of us she was trying to preserve. I didn't give her that. I didn't accuse her of anything. Accusations invite defense. I wasn't interested in defense. I said very little, just enough to make it clear I wasn't confused, that I understood exactly what had happened, that I had listened when she dismissed intimacy publicly and reorganized my life accordingly. She asked what that meant, not angrily, carefully, like someone afraid of the answer. I told her I'd stopped participating in something that required me to disappear quietly so it could continue functioning. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I wasn't coming back to explain myself to people who'd already noticed I was gone. That was when she lost control of the conversation. Not emotionally. Strategically. She asked if this was punishment. I shook my head. Punishment requires engagement. This was distance. She reached for shared history, for years of building, for plans we'd made. I didn't deny any of it. I just didn't let it outweigh what she'd undone in front of witnesses. When she realized I wasn't negotiating terms, her voice softened. She asked if there was anything she could do to fix it. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and told her I'd already fixed what mattered. I walked away before she could follow. That was the moment she understood this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about access, and she no longer had it. Her collapse didn't look dramatic from the outside. There were no public scenes, no messages she could point to as evidence of betrayal. That made it worse. Without something concrete to react against, everything turned inward. People stopped asking about me directly. Instead, they asked questions around me. How she was doing. Whether she seemed tired. If work had been stressful. Concern shifted away from curiosity and settled into assessment. She felt it immediately. When sympathy replaces interest, control is already gone. The man from her past faded faster than she expected. Comfort without obligation has a short shelf life once it's asked to explain itself. When pressure arrived, he retreated into vagueness. Busy schedules, emotional limits, a return to the distance that had made him safe in the first place. She couldn't accuse him of leaving. He'd never stayed. At home, the quiet hardened. The same rooms that once reflected stability now amplified her isolation. The house didn't echo with loss. It echoed with absence. The furniture stayed exactly where it was, but nothing moved through it with purpose anymore. She started sleeping poorly, waking early, replaying conversations she could no longer influence. Family calls became harder. On Zoom, she spoke less. When my name came up, she changed the subject or smiled thinly. The explanations that once flowed easily now stalled. Silence settled in places where reassurance used to be. No one confronted her. They didn't need to. Distance had already done the work. She reached out to me again, this time without framing it as concern or confusion. She acknowledged mistakes without naming them. She talked about loss without saying what she'd lost. She said she finally understood what my presence had stabilized. Not emotionally, structurally. I read the message slowly and didn't respond. That was when memory started turning against her. Small moments resurfaced without mercy. Things I'd done quietly, consistently. The way I'd carried responsibility without asking for credit. At the time, it had felt normal. Now it felt irreplaceable. Each realization arrived too late to change anything. Regret doesn't move backward. It just deepens the present. By then, my life no longer revolved around explaining my absence. I had routines that didn't intersect with her collapse. The distance between us wasn't emotional anymore. It was logistical. Final. Her world didn't end because I left. It ended because she finally understood what had been holding it together. And that understanding arrived when there was no one left to hand it to. The last time I heard about her, it wasn't from her. It was from someone else, relaying concern the way people do when they don't know where to place responsibility anymore. They said she seemed tired, distracted. They said she talked about clarity as if it were something external, something that might still arrive if she waited long enough. I didn't correct them. I didn't offer context. I've learned that silence, used consistently, becomes its own explanation. By then, my life had settled into something quiet and deliberate. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just clean. I woke up without anticipating messages. I walked without replaying conversations. I listened to Audible in the mornings, not to escape, but because I liked how other voices filled the space without demanding anything back. The absence she still felt no longer registered on my end. She sent one final message months later. No framing, no theory, no language about growth or boundaries. Just an admission that losing me hadn't felt real at first because I'd never made a scene. She said that was what confused her the most, that she kept expecting a reaction she could respond to. She said the quiet had been unbearable. I read it once. I didn't archive it. I didn't delete it either. Some things don't need a response to be complete. People assume closure comes from conversation. It doesn't. It comes from alignment. From realizing that the life you're living finally matches the standards you stopped defending out loud. I never told her where I was going or what I was building next. I didn't need to. The version of me that would have explained himself no longer existed. That role had ended the night she dismissed intimacy in front of witnesses and expected me to remain in the background, supportive and invisible. I didn't disappear to make a point. I disappeared because staying would have meant agreeing to be reduced. If she tells people now that she doesn't know why I left, that's true in the way people mean when they've rewritten the cause. If she says the silence changed her, that might also be true. But transformation that arrives after access is gone doesn't reopen doors. I didn't vanish. I simply stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. And once I did that, everything else fell into place without a single word from me. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.